Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to unpack a political upset that really sent shockwaves way beyond New York City. We're talking about Zohran Mamdani's, well, pretty unexpected victory in the June 2025 Democratic mayoral primary. He defeated Andrew Cuomo. Now, if you follow New York politics at all, you know Cuomo,
Well, Titan.
right, a dynastic figure,
Right.
seemed almost unmovable. Yet Mamdani, who's, 33, a Democratic socialist, he just completely dismantled that political machine. So our mission here in this deep dive is to explore how this local primary win is being seen as, well, a genuinely transformative moment in American politics. There's sources who've got campaign data, voter demographics, political analyses. They suggest it might even signal a broader shift, a move away from what some are calling fear-driven politics. So let's try and understand this political tremor. Okay, let's get right into it then. How did a relatively unknown state assemblyman who started polling in the single digits, how did he manage such a stunning upset against someone like Cuomo? What was the secret sauce there?
It really is a remarkable story, isn't it? What's fascinating about Mamdani's campaign, I think, is how he just completely flipped the traditional script. Our sources, they describe it as a kind of masterclass in political alchemy. It blended real grassroots effort with some incredibly smart digital stuff. And you saw the contrast, right? Cuomo's campaign felt, well, honestly, pretty joyless, lots of warnings. Mamdani, on the other hand, projected this infectious optimism, but it was rooted in solutions for everyday problems people face.
I definitely noticed that. The contrast was really stark. It felt less about what voters should be afraid of and much more about what they could actually gain. This idea you mentioned, the politics of abundance versus scarcity politics, that really seemed to come through. Can you give us some examples of how that actually played out?
Absolutely. Think about moments like Mamdani coining the term halalflation at a food cart in Queens. He immediately tapped into a very specific, very real economic anxiety, but he did it with humor and, a focus on finding solutions. Or, remember his 13-mile Manhattan walk? That wasn't just some stunt. It became this huge viral sensation, racking up millions of views on X and TikTok, complete with selfies and pizza breaks along the way.
And it felt so, I don't know, so New York.
Yeah.
So authentic. That's what the sources highlight, too. 67%, I think it was, of his voters specifically mentioned authenticity as the main reason they supported him. It wasn't slick or overly polished, which I think really resonated.
Precisely. His sort of unpolished videos, his relentless door knocking, it all conveyed this sincerity that was frankly missing from Cuomo's campaign, and that authenticity carried over to his platform, which, at first glance seemed almost deceptively simple. It focused on really concrete problems, free buses, rent freezes, universal childcare, even looking at city-run grocery stores.
I remember the New York Times editorial board scoffing at some of those ideas, calling them pie in the sky. Yeah. But Mamdani really leaned into this core idea that a mayor could actively lower the cost of living for people. Yeah. He even proposed that municipal investment fund, right, financed by a small tax on financial transactions as a way to actually pay for these things.
Exactly. And that's where his whole abundance approach really comes into focus. Yeah. It sort of challenges that old assumption that voters are just, a bundle of anxieties you can exploit. Instead, his campaign seemed to treat them like rational actors, people who, if you give them a viable plan for a better life, will choose solutions over just, scare tactics. It's a pretty fundamental recalibration, I think, of how candidates can connect.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, right. So if that was his campaign style and approach, who exactly were these voters? The ones who were so captivated and powered this really unprecedented upset?
Well, the data paints a very clear picture here. Mamdani's coalition was remarkably young. It was diverse and often made up of voters who felt, disaffected by what they saw as political complacency. We're talking about a significant demographic shift happening.
The numbers are pretty striking when you look at them. He won, 67% of 18 to 34-year-old college graduates?
Yeah.
And a massive 78% of all voters under 35.
Yeah.
Plus 71% of voters earning less than $50,000 a year, and 64% of those who call themselves very liberal. That's a really strong, specific base he built.
It truly is. And what's maybe even more telling is the generational divide it exposed. So while older New Yorkers, for instance, might still put issues like crime at the top, our sources clearly show younger voters are just overwhelmingly concerned with housing affordability, economic opportunity. And this led to a really dramatic electoral realignment.
And the turnout figures really underscore that, don't they? Compared to the 2021 primary, turnout among voters aged 18 to 35 just exploded. It went up by 340%.
Yeah, 340%.
Meanwhile, turnout among voters over 65 actually went down by 12%. I mean, that's a huge realignment, not just a minor shift.
It really is. And what I find particularly insightful from the analysis is how Mamdani built this genuinely multiracial, multi-class coalition without leaning heavily on traditional identity politics.
How so?
Well, his campaign materials, they weren't really focused on explicit racial or ethnic messaging. Instead, they centered on these shared economic struggles, these class-based themes that seem to resonate across very diverse neighborhoods, places like Jackson Heights and Sunset Park. It showed that his message about economic transformation could actually cut across those traditional ethnic and linguistic lines.
So if we think about the broader picture, this kind of demographic shift, it feels like, as you said, a tectonic plate moving. What does this tell us about the future of political strategies, especially those fear-based tactics we talked about?
I think it strongly suggests that the old playbooks, the demagoguery, the fear-mongering, they might just be losing their effectiveness, particularly as this younger, more policy-focused generation starts flexing its electoral muscle. It really challenges the conventional wisdom about how you build coalitions in diverse urban places. It shows there's a real responsiveness to these class-based appeals among younger voters, people who are often economically precarious and clearly looking for something genuinely different.
Okay, so if this demographic pivot is that significant, what does Mamdani's victory really tell us about the wider landscape of American politics, specifically what the sources are calling Trump-style fear politics?
Well, it's definitely being interpreted by many analysts as a pretty definitive rejection of that exact style. Remember, these fear-driven campaigns, they operate on the idea that if you terrify people enough, they'll run to the arms of a self-proclaimed savior, right? Cuomo's campaign, especially towards the end, really seemed to mimic a sort of miniature version of that Trump approach. Dire warnings about crime, economic collapse, social chaos, if voters chose the quote-unquote radical alternative.
And the sources point out that kind of strategy, that threat efficacy model, it works.
Yeah.
Until it doesn't. And in New York City this time, it just seems like the electorate had developed a kind of tolerance, like they'd heard it all before.
Exactly. It just didn't land. And the sources also highlight what a strategic blunder it turned out to be for the GOP as well. Even though Trump's 2024 win relied partly on building a multiracial coalition, their attacks on Mamdani, specifically the Islamophobic ones, related to his pro-Palestinian stance and calling the Gaza situation a genocide, they completely backfired.
That's fascinating. So those attacks actually pushed away the very multiracial voters the GOP had been trying to court.
That's what the analysis suggests. And not only that, but younger voters apparently interpreted those attacks as proof that the establishment saw Mamdani as a genuine threat to the status quo.
Which, paradoxically, ended up boosting his favorability.
It did. And there's an underlying reason, the sources argue, for why this fear-based messaging failed, especially with younger voters. It's their information environment. Unlike previous generations, millennials and Gen Z, they can fact-check claims almost instantly. They can access alternative viewpoints immediately.
Right.
And they've lived through what they probably see as a whole series of manufactured crises, right? WMDs in Iraq, the 2008 financial crash, the kind of perpetual emergency feeling of the Trump years.
So they've just become incredibly skeptical of warnings coming from the establishment. For this generation, maybe a radical alternative seems less risky than just sticking with what they see as failed orthodoxies.
That's a key insight. It really raises the question, is there a natural exhaustion point for all this negative partisanship, this politics of manufactured crisis? I think the sources definitely suggest that, yeah. For a generation that's watched conventional wisdom be wrong time and time again, the idea of genuinely new alternatives can feel less risky than just sticking with the same old thing. It also might signal a potential return to a more substantive kind of political engagement, where voters are actually responding to authenticity and potential solutions, not just reacting to fear.
Okay, so if this isn't just a one-off New York story, what are the bigger lessons here? What can Democrats nationally take away from Mamdani's win? Is there some kind of blueprint?
The sources certainly suggest there might be. Mamdani's intense focus on affordability, tackling everything from halalflation, as we mentioned, to just cramped apartments. It tapped into really universal anxieties. And interestingly, it even resonated with some voters in the Bronx who had previously leaned towards Trump. That shows these economic issues can really cut across traditional political divides.
David Axelrod even commented on it, didn't he? He called Mamdani's approach principled and agile and suggested it could redefine Democratic messaging, especially compared to what he saw as Kamala Harris's more scripted 2024 campaign.
Right.
It does sound like a potential roadmap for countering what some people call fake populism.
Exactly. It shows that connecting with voters on these tangible kitchen table economic issues, rather than maybe focusing only on cultural or identity fronts, can build these powerful, sometimes unexpected coalitions. However, it's definitely worth noting that the Democratic establishment wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for this new model.
Oh, that's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries,
Mm-hmm.
they famously held back endorsements. Some Democrats, like Laura Gillen out on Long Island, called Mamdani too extreme.
Yeah.
Our sources suggest this really echoes how they dismissed figures like Bernie Sanders or AOC in the past. It highlights what some analysts call a curiosity problem within the party establishment, one that can potentially lose elections.
It's definitely a recurring tension, isn't it? So the big question then becomes, is New York City just an outlier? Or is this actually a sign of broader trends emerging?
And the early evidence, at least according to these sources, suggests it might be more widespread. You look at municipal elections in places like Seattle, Minneapolis, Richmond,
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing similar patterns. Younger candidates, explicitly progressive platforms, defeating more established moderate types.
Right.
Plus, there was that PRRI survey mentioned. It found voters under 35 in large cities across the country, regardless of region, hold views on economic policy that aligned very closely with Mamdani's platform.
That's a critical point, I think. It suggests that the electoral coalition that really powered Trump's rise, the one based largely on cultural anxiety, economic nationalism, maybe resistance to demographic change, it might be hitting its limits, at least in urban America. Mamdani's victory offers a potential path forward, a way to maybe bridge some of the divides that have, plagued progressive politics since 2016. It could be a synthesis of left-wing economic policies delivered through really pragmatic political organizing.
So potentially providing a new template for building that kind of multiracial cross-class coalition for future elections. Maybe even looking ahead to something as big as the 2028 presidential race.
It's possible.
If you connect this to the bigger picture, it does offer a kind of glimpse of renewal for American democracy, doesn't it?
It really does, I think. Mamdani's win provides actual evidence that American voters, especially younger ones, are still very capable of responding to appeals based on hope, on possibility, on collective action. It challenges that cynical view that our democracy is just fundamentally broken. It shows that when people feel like their voice actually matters, they might be less susceptible to simple fear-mongering.
Okay, this primary win is clearly significant, but it's not over yet. What does the road ahead look like for Mamdani heading into the general election in November?
That's right. It's definitely not a clear path. He's facing a pretty challenging four-way race. You've got Curtis Sliwa, the Republican nominee. You've got Eric Adams, the incumbent mayor, running as an independent now. And there's still the possibility that Cuomo could jump back in as an independent, too.
So even with New York City's usual 6-to-1 Democratic registration advantage, Adams still has those ties to Trump supporters, potentially. And Cuomo has that established donor network. Those are real risks.
Yeah.
And the New York Times is already sounding the alarm, right?
Yeah.
Warning that Mamdani's agenda could risk fiscal ruin, especially with declining commercial tax revenue.
These are definitely the kinds of traditional attacks he'll face, real challenges. However, Mamdani's very clear stance on protecting sanctuary city policies, fighting potential federal deportations under a future administration, that positions him as a distinct bulwark against any, Meg Gier-style policies. That's a key part of his appeal to his base.
And on a slightly lighter note, I did find it pretty funny that the sources mentioned Mamdani admitting his biggest personal challenge might be just finishing season 3 of White Lotus. Apparently he watches it in 15-minute naps.
Yes, a very relatable struggle for a lot of busy people, I imagine. But joking aside, it does raise that important question. Can a campaign built so much on authenticity and substantive policy translate effectively into that rough-and-tumble general election environment? Especially when you're facing those predictable attacks on fiscal responsibility and just the sheer complexity of governing a city like New York, it's going to be a real test, I think, of whether that radical normalcy his campaign projected can actually become a, quote, living, breathing testament to achieving mutually beneficial change.
So wrapping up, Mamdani's win is, without a doubt, a political earthquake, right? It's shaking the foundations of both that Trump-style fear politics and maybe some Democratic complacency, too. It really demonstrates powerfully that a message of hope, genuine affordability, and, even a good meme can sometimes outshine fear and big money.
Absolutely. And looking beyond New York, his model seems to offer Democrats a really critical opportunity. A chance to reclaim voters by speaking directly to their wallets, their economic realities, their hopes, not just playing on their fears and anxieties. Now, the big question remains, right? Does November cement this shift, or does the establishment somehow find a way to strike back? But one thing seems pretty certain. Mamdani definitely has the internet's vote, and well, in 2025, that's got to be at least half the battle.
It really makes you think. Mamdani's victory suggests that maybe when voters are treated more like intelligent adults rather than just emotional children to be manipulated, and when politics is treated like a serious thing worthy of real engagement, not just elaborate entertainment, well, maybe something truly transformative can happen. What possibilities does that open up for political conversations in your own community? Maybe. Or even nationally, if we all chose, engagement over just fear.